The gates stand closed, weathered and silent, the ivy crawling across wrought iron as if to claim it for itself. Inside, rooms once alive with strategy, influence, and calculated display now echo with absence. Chandeliers hang untouched, their crystal prisms catching light in the way dust catches memory. The walls, adorned with portraits and murals, seem to lean in, listening for conversations that will never return. The corridors are long, and the air is thick with the residue of decisions made in whispers, of alliances brokered over dinner tables and drawing-room fires. Somewhere in the depths of this mansion, the pulse of authority that once defined a family empire has slowed to a tremor. It is tempting to see only wealth and opulence here, yet the mansion's architecture, the ordering of rooms, the placement of portraits, the quiet insistence of formality, all speak to power as a living, breathing force. And when power falters, when influence recedes, it is not just the family who is diminished, it is the very culture that their walls once contained. Now, as the estate changes hands, as decisions are made for reasons far removed from its original purpose, the mansion stands as a witness. Its grandeur is intact, but the ideology it once projected has thinned. This is not merely a house, it is a stage on which an empire's internal politics were performed, and on which their traces are quietly, irreversibly fading.
Chapter 1. Rupture at the Gates. The gates themselves are the first indicator of absence. Once polished to a gleam, their ironwork precise and deliberate, they now carry the dull patina of neglect. A hinge creaks under the weight of accumulated seasons, a sound unfamiliar in a space that once operated with the smooth, measured certainty of authority. Beyond them, the carriage drive cuts a familiar path through the lawns, but the grass presses inward, untrimmed, asserting a quiet encroachment. The mansion stands at the end of that approach, imposing yet strangely diminished, its stone facades, carved with the heraldic symbols of a family accustomed to shaping both landscape and society, now appears suspended in a state of incomplete vigilance, as though awaiting a master who no longer comes. Inside, the emptiness manifests differently. Doorways, usually portals between controlled spaces, reveal corridors stripped of purpose. The grand hall, where light once pooled across polished floors, now reflects the slow accumulation of dust and a stillness previously inconceivable. Curtains hang without movement, and the rooms designed to orchestrate human interaction and display seem to hold their breath. It is as though the mansion, accustomed to directing the rhythms of life within its walls, has been left to adapt to silence. Each hallway, each vestibule, carries a latent expectation of authority, of calculated presence. Yet that expectation is now unfulfilled, an echo that fills the space more thoroughly than any human voice could. The architecture itself gestures to the rupture. Cornices and balustrades, meticulously designed to convey control and hierarchy, are intact but inert. The mansion's scale and proportion, once active instruments of power, now serve only as reminders of what was once operational. The rooms, drawing rooms, libraries, and private chambers retain traces of ritual. Furniture remains aligned with ceremonial precision. Portraits still gaze from their frames, but the choreography of influence, the movement that gave meaning to these objects, has halted. In these frozen arrangements, one perceives not abandonment, but a deliberate absence, a signal that authority has withdrawn from its physical anchor. Even the peripheral spaces, the service wings, the kitchens, the stables, reflect this disruption. Where staff once moved with orchestrated efficiency, there are now only hints of past order. Floors are polished sporadically. Equipment lies dormant. The estate's operational heartbeat has slowed to irregular pulses, a rhythm misaligned with the architectural insistence of control. Through the windows, light falls unevenly, illuminating rooms in partial gestures, as if hesitant to trespass. Each sunbeam traces the contours of absence, a polished banister untouched, a stack of correspondence unopened, a mirror reflecting an uninhabited corridor. The mansion is not simply empty, it is suspended in a state of unfinished function. In its silence, the absence of its human and institutional authority is made tangible. The very atmosphere of the building conveys a subtle unease, the sensation that the structure itself perceives the withdrawal of the forces it was designed to contain and amplify. The gardens, too, mirror the interior condition. Elaborate parterres, once meticulously maintained, now allow wild growth to insinuate itself along rigid geometric lines. Fountains, which historically punctuated processions of guests and carriage arrivals with ritualized sound, are dry or sluggish, their mechanics still but unresponsive. Even in decay, the landscape speaks to past intention. The sculpted hedges, axial pathways, and sightlines all testify to a vision of control. But that vision is no longer enacted, leaving only the skeleton of purpose. The mansion's reach into its surroundings has slackened, a quiet surrender that contrasts with the historical insistence on order. The rupture at the gates is both material and ideological. The physical threshold, gates, drive, portico, is no longer a line of passage into structured authority. It is a liminal zone, a space between the memory of power and its present absence. Those who remain on the estate navigate an environment still imbued with the weight of a vanished protocol, a mansion that exerts influence not through action, but through the persistence of its form. The structure itself has become a record of withdrawal, a living archive in which the machinery of authority is visible only in its paused, partial state. Chapter 2. Cultural Gravity. Even in stillness, the mansion radiates a presence that extends far beyond its walls. Its significance was never solely in stone, timber, or marble. It existed in the precise orchestration of human interaction, in the choreography of hierarchy enacted daily within its rooms. Every hall, every salon, every staircase was designed not only to contain the occupants, but to shape them. The mansion functioned as an axis of influence, a site where social expectations were codified and displayed, where decisions, political, financial, and cultural, were distilled through ritualized gatherings. To enter the estate was to participate in a language of power, one articulated through seating arrangements, the timing of arrivals, and the subtle demarcations of space between host and guest. The mansion was, in effect, a cultural instrument, projecting authority outward into networks that stretched well beyond its immediate geography. Even casual observation would reveal its gravitational pull. Families of inherited wealth, industrial magnates, and rising political figures were drawn here not merely by hospitality, but by the tacit contract the house imposed, to conform, to observe, to measure one's own position in relation to its codes. Formal dinners were not social diversions, but carefully calibrated performances. The placement of a chair, the selection of conversation topics, even the pauses between courses were cues in a silent language understood by few, but recognized by all. In these rituals, the mansion transmitted influence in a manner that transcended wealth. It encoded social authority as practice, habit, and expectation. Outside observers, even those in the city's commercial districts, felt the mansion's effects indirectly. Policies and alliances often germinated within its salons, filtered outward through networks of correspondence and recommendation. Invitations, so carefully granted, were themselves markers of favor, creating an invisible hierarchy that dictated movement, attention, and opportunity across the upper echelons of society. To be absent from this sphere was to be structurally disadvantaged, for the mansion functioned as a clearinghouse of knowledge, taste, and strategic awareness. Its interiors further reinforced this cultural command. Art, architecture, and decor were chosen with deliberate reference to lineage, sophistication, and authority. Portraits were positioned to assert continuity. Libraries and collections were curated to reflect not mere wealth, but discernment, erudition, and mastery over both knowledge and society. The mansion's design, at every turn, demanded recognition of hierarchy, of precedence, of the subtle gradations of influence that governed its inhabitants' movements. In effect, culture was both material and performative here. The house itself dictated the parameters of acceptable action, while the occupants enacted those parameters with ritual precision. Even the informal spaces, the morning drawing rooms, the garden terraces, the small parlors for confidential conversation, contributed to the mansion's magnetic authority. These spaces permitted the negotiation of power away from public scrutiny, allowing alliances to form, strategies to be tested, and influence to be quietly redistributed. The architecture supported surveillance as much as hospitality. A glance across a room, a line of sight from staircase to salon, all served as instruments for maintaining order and expectation. The mansion's structure was a silent arbiter of social reality, where human ambition was continually measured against a physical manifestation of inherited power. Through its constant assertion of control over movement, sight, and interaction, the mansion became an epicenter of cultural gravity. Its authority was absorbed slowly, almost imperceptibly, by those who entered. Guests left not merely with the memory of opulent surroundings, but with an awareness of their own relative position within the lattice of elite influence. The mansion did not simply host, it encoded. It translated architectural scale and spatial arrangement into social weight, imposing a logic that extended across the wider networks of Gilded Age society.
Chapter 3: Foundations of Power. The mansion, in its original conception, was never intended as mere habitation. Its commissioning emerged from a precise calculus, a spatial assertion of influence, a physical articulation of authority that could endure beyond a single lifetime. From the first drawings, the design communicated hierarchy, discipline, and the projection of a family's vision onto both land and society. The architect's plan, in consultation with the family, delineated a series of interlocking circuits, public rooms, private quarters, service areas, each calculated to produce a particular social effect. Every entrance, every staircase, every sight line was deliberate, a conduit for the assertion of order and control. The house was conceived as an organism in which the occupant exercised both sovereignty and restraint, a structure through which power could be enacted materially and symbolically. The scale of the project itself spoke to ambition. Ceilings rose higher than necessity dictated, corridors extended beyond mere function, and facades carried ornamentation that referenced both lineage and classical ideals. These were choices intended to impress upon every visitor, every observer, the magnitude of the family's reach.
Stone and marble, carved with heraldic motifs and subtle iconography, acted as persistent reminders of continuity, of heritage elevated into architectural permanence. The mansion's very bulk projected authority into its environment. Gardens, terraces, and adjacent landscapes were subordinated to the geometry of the building, reinforcing the centrality of human will over natural growth. The ideological underpinning of the construction was explicit. The family's intent was to manifest a synthesis of wealth, taste, and governance, creating a space in which domestic life and institutional authority were inseparable. Rooms were not neutral, they were instruments, encoding expectations of conduct and comportment. The public salons were designed to stage interactions of negotiation and observation, while private chambers maintained the discipline and privacy necessary for the consolidation of influence. The mansion's articulation of space enforced a hierarchy in which each inhabitant, servant, or visitor became cognizant of their place within a defined social lattice. Every decorative decision reinforced this philosophy. Portraits of ancestors were carefully cited to imply continuity of judgment. Collections of art were displayed to signify discernment, erudition, and command over both aesthetic and social conventions. Light, both natural and artificial, was considered in relation to these displays, ensuring that authority was visible without overt assertion. Even subtle architectural elements, molding profiles, proportions of windows, thresholds between rooms, acted as instruments of persuasion, teaching occupants to internalize the mansion's logic of order. The building itself became an active participant in the maintenance of hierarchy. Construction techniques mirrored the conceptual ambitions. Skilled artisans were employed not merely for craftsmanship, but to ensure that every surface, joint, and fixture reflected a precise standard of execution. The integrity of the materials was prioritized alongside the coherence of the design, producing a structure capable of enduring both time and scrutiny. Each laborer, each craftsman operated within a framework dictated by the overarching vision, contributing to an edifice that was simultaneously a work of art, a machine of social regulation, and a symbol of permanence. The location of the mansion was equally deliberate. Its positioning on elevated ground, aligned with major approaches and sightlines, allowed both visibility and control over the surrounding landscape. Visitors approached along a procession, entering the estate on paths designed to heighten awareness of scale and significance. The mansion's presence dominated the horizon, a constant reminder of authority exerted not only within its walls, but across the larger environment it surveyed. Beyond the immediate family, the estate's design communicated to a wider audience. Business associates, social peers, and political figures all encountered an environment structured to convey influence. Every element, from the symmetry of the facade to the hierarchy of room access, served as a lesson in power translated into form. In commissioning such a mansion, the family was establishing more than a residence. It was codifying a system in stone and timber, one that rendered abstract ambition legible, persistent, and inescapable.
Chapter 4. Mechanics of Empire. The mansion's operation extended far beyond its architecture. It was a living system, a precise orchestration of labor, timing, and ritual designed to sustain influence. Each morning, the household awakened as though by clockwork, staff moving in carefully defined circuits. Servants, visible and invisible, followed hierarchies rigidly established over decades. Housekeepers and valets managed the domestic sphere with exacting attention, while chefs and kitchen staff maintained the flow of sustenance that underpinned both private and ceremonial life.
Every gesture, every task was embedded in a structure that conflated efficiency with social instruction. Those who labored learned the discipline required to maintain the veneer of order, while the mansion itself projected authority simply by functioning without friction. Financial management was similarly exacting. Ledgers recorded not only expenses for food, labor, and maintenance, but also allowances, gifts, and obligations. The flow of money into and out of the household reflected the priorities of the family: patronage, appearances, and the quiet maintenance of influence across social networks. Accounts were not mere bookkeeping, they were instruments through which authority was exercised. Staff, from stewards to accountants, internalized the logic of scarcity and surplus, understanding that each expenditure reinforced the household's ability to operate as a center of social and economic power. Routines structured both private and public life. Meals followed strict schedules: breakfasts for family and intimate guests, luncheons for business associates, dinners for formal gatherings. The preparation, presentation, and even the sequencing of courses were carefully managed. Protocol dictated seating arrangements, introductions, and the timing of conversation, ensuring that hierarchy was made tangible at every encounter. Beyond food, daily rituals extended to housekeeping, correspondence, and the maintenance of the estate itself. Gardens were inspected, fountains checked, stables cleaned, all within a cadence that reinforced the mansion's rhythm. The hierarchy among staff mirrored that of the household itself. Senior stewards coordinated subordinate teams. Chambermaids and footmen operated under direct supervision. Cooks and scullery workers attended to both function and form. This stratification ensured clarity of responsibility, while also creating a microcosm in which obedience, discretion, and awareness of relative position were constantly reinforced. Staff learned not merely to execute tasks, but to anticipate the needs of the household, to act preemptively, and to maintain a presence that was simultaneously effective and invisible. Social protocols intertwined with operational discipline. Guests were not simply entertained, they were oriented within a web of expectation and influence. Invitations, arrivals, and departures were meticulously timed. Certain rooms were reserved for particular categories of visitor, creating spatial hierarchies that reflected social standing. The mansion's circulation patterns, corridors, staircases, and galleries, channeled behavior subtly, guiding both residents and visitors through spaces that communicated precedence, authority, and propriety. Even casual encounters were structured. A glance, a nod, a pause in movement could reinforce rank without verbal assertion. The household's labor extended beyond the visible. Cellars, storage rooms, and service corridors functioned as hidden networks supporting the mansion's public face. Mechanical systems, ventilation, water, heating required oversight, and the management of supplies demanded foresight and coordination. Behind every polished surface, every arranged chair, there was a lattice of human activity, a complex interweaving of effort that maintained the mansion's presentation of uninterrupted order. Each operation, no matter how minor, contributed to the perception of authority and control.
Chapter 5. Golden Age. At the mansion's zenith, every corridor, salon, and gallery was animated with purpose. The house did not merely accommodate its inhabitants, it orchestrated them. Drawing rooms thrummed with conversation that was never casual. Alliances were tested, reputations measured, influence observed. Every event, from formal dinners to informal receptions, operated as an extension of the family's authority.
The mansion functioned as a nexus, a centralized stage upon which networks of power intersected. Its spatial design ensured that proximity conferred privilege, that access was a constant negotiation, and that every gesture, seated, standing, even arriving or departing, was observed, recorded, and interpreted. The calendar of the household reflected this precise orchestration. Weeks were organized around recurring patterns, receptions for industrial leaders, luncheons for political figures, evenings for intimate counsel. Each gathering maintained a rhythm that was both habitual and strategic. Staff moved silently but rigorously behind the scenes, enabling the seamless execution of these events. Table settings, lighting, and the placement of chairs were not merely ceremonial, they were instruments of subtle control, shaping how individuals interacted, who spoke first, and who remained in the periphery. The mansion's interiors imposed a logic upon social behavior, making every encounter a controlled demonstration of order and authority. Financial and social influence were inseparable during this period. Contracts, investments, and patronage were frequently arranged within the mansion's walls, often under the guise of conversation and hospitality. Guests understood that access conferred opportunity. Proximity to the family equated to insight into decisions whose effects radiated across commerce, industry, and society. The mansion's physical scale allowed simultaneous gatherings without overlap, permitting discreet negotiations alongside more public displays of taste and refinement. This spatial capacity amplified its role as an epicenter. Influence was both concentrated and diffused, projected outward through carefully calibrated exposure. Chapter 6: Encroaching Pressures. Societal transformation pressed in with equal quietude. The networks of deference that had ensured compliance and recognition were loosening. Emerging families, new wealth, and shifting social attitudes disrupted patterns of influence carefully maintained for generations. Invitations that once conferred prestige became more contested, subtly eroding the mansion's monopoly on recognition. The rituals of etiquette, the carefully codified hierarchies, and the expectation of deference all persisted within the house, yet outside observers increasingly measured authority against alternative standards of status and opportunity. The mansion's internal logic remained intact, even as its external resonance began to falter. Transitions within the family further complicated this landscape. Generational change, differing priorities, and the gradual reallocation of attention to new estates, ventures, and lifestyles introduced fissures in the household's coherence. Rooms once used for strategic discussion fell into quieter use. Staff hierarchies, though still maintained, required recalibration to account for shifting patterns of oversight. Decision-making, which had been centralized and disciplined, now faced competing demands. Authority remained present, but it was diffused, its projection weakened by subtle divergences in focus and intent. These pressures were rarely abrupt. They unfolded incrementally, almost imperceptibly. Financial strains, though manageable, introduced delays in maintenance and staffing decisions. Social challenges, expressed through absence, criticism, or reduced engagement, quietly undermined the mansion's claim to primacy. Even minor neglect, gardens allowed to soften their edges, minor repairs postponed, rituals performed less rigorously, signaled the tension between the mansion's inherited authority and the realities beyond its gates. Every room, corridor, and gallery bore witness to the adjustments made in response to these pressures, a testament to the mansion's attempt to maintain equilibrium under changing conditions. Operationally, the household began to adapt in measured ways. Staff were reassigned, routines slightly altered, resources redistributed. These modifications, while subtle, reflected an acknowledgement that the mansion's systems could no longer operate entirely as designed. The architecture, the hierarchy, and the social choreography remained, yet each required calibration to accommodate contingencies that had once been irrelevant. The mansion itself absorbed these pressures silently, its spaces maintaining the semblance of order, even as the forces shaping authority became more complex and less predictable.
Chapter 7. Extraction and Hollowing.
Staffing patterns shifted accordingly. Long-standing hierarchies were compressed, positions eliminated or consolidated. Expertise, once cultivated and passed down, was no longer sustained. Those who remained carried heavier burdens but had fewer resources with which to maintain the house's standards. Rituals that had once punctuated the day, inspections, cleaning cycles, preparatory tasks for receptions, were abbreviated or skipped entirely. The mansion continued to operate, but in diminished mode. Its pulse weakened, its authority attenuated by the loss of habitual attention and institutional memory. Financial extraction was mirrored in social extraction. Invitations, correspondence, and ceremonial observances became sporadic. The mansion's presence in the networks of influence it had once centralized grew intermittent. Guests were received less frequently, events were smaller, less formal, and increasingly transactional. The gravitational pull of the estate, which had once orchestrated behavior and codified hierarchy, was muted. The house maintained its proportions and its decorative veneer, but its capacity to produce authority and shape interaction was progressively diminished. The architectural consequences of these processes were subtle but insistent. Dust gathered in spaces once meticulously polished, gardens softened along formal lines, mechanical systems fell into intermittent operation. Thresholds that had guided movement, sightlines that had reinforced hierarchy, and galleries that had staged observation now lacked the human reinforcement that had given them meaning. The mansion's structure was unchanged, yet its function, the deliberate projection of order and control, was impaired. Every corner of the estate reflected this tension, the persistence of form juxtaposed against the withdrawal of operational purpose.
Chapter 8. Surviving Traces. The mansion endures, but not in the fullness of its former purpose. Stone facades remain aligned, cornices retain their precision, and porticos continue to articulate authority across the lawns. The architecture persists as a physical record, a ledger of intention and scale, yet its capacity to operate as a locus of influence has diminished. Windows reflect the external light as they always have, but now that reflection no longer carries the weight of social expectation. Where once movement through the halls communicated hierarchy, now passage is occasional and unobserved. The persistence of form signals permanence, yet the absence of habitual function renders the house a stage with few actors. Inside, certain traces of the mansion's operational life remain visible. Libraries retain collections, though some shelves are hollowed by the sale of volumes. Desks still carry ink stains and the imprint of correspondence, yet the channels that once gave these surfaces consequence have long since dissipated. Portraits, tapestries, and decorative objects continue to occupy their prescribed positions, gestures toward continuity and legacy, yet they operate as silent witnesses rather than instruments of authority. Light falls along corridors and staircases still directed by the original design, but it illuminates spaces largely devoid of active ceremony. Form and function are increasingly dislocated, creating an uncanny tension between what exists and what was enacted. Beyond the tangible, archives endure in subdued fashion. Ledgers, letters, and memoranda trace the rhythms of daily operation and the exercise of influence. They provide a record of hierarchy, of precision, of the household as an orchestrated organism. Their presence confirms the mansion's former reach and complexity, yet they also underscore its absence. The documents are not instruments of authority, they are evidence of it, preserved in a state of inactivity. The mansion's legacy, therefore, is both material and historical. The physical objects remain, but the networks of engagement that gave them power are gone. Even the surrounding grounds continue to articulate the mansion's former imprint. Terraces, gardens, and sightlines retain the geometry and order imposed by design, yet the labor that once sustained these spaces has shifted to sporadic maintenance. Paths remain aligned, hedges follow original axes, and fountains, where operational, mark the edges of control rather than its exertion. The estate still signals intention, yet the rigor of daily enactment has softened. Nature presses in, quietly revealing the distinction between survival of structure and survival of function. The cultural imprint, though intangible, remains legible. Scholars, architects, and descendants of the social networks once centered on the mansion continue to reference its forms, its systems, and its rituals. Knowledge of its interior choreography, the sequence of events, and the roles of staff persists in written accounts and oral histories. The mansion operates as a symbol of what power required, of what hierarchy demanded, of what influence was achieved. Yet the transmission of that knowledge is retrospective, not operational. The estate's legacy, therefore, is both material and historical. The physical objects remain, but the networks of engagement that gave them power are gone.
Chapter 9. Legacy and Reflection. The mansion, now largely silent, offers a different kind of testimony. Its walls, polished or worn, its staircases, corridors, and halls articulate the persistence of intention even after the systems that once animated them have receded. Authority, once exercised through daily ritual, is now measured through absence. The careful choreography of staff, the orchestration of guests, the ceaseless management of form and appearance, all of these are now preserved in memory, in records, and in the architecture itself. The house remains a vessel, not of current power, but of accumulated influence, a trace of a system that governed behavior and structured networks far beyond its physical boundaries. The mansion invites consideration of what authority truly endures. Material form persists, yet the potency that gave those forms consequence has dissipated. Windows reflect light, doors close as designed, staircases rise to upper chambers. These details, precise and enduring, mark the skill of builders, artisans, and organizers, yet they do not confer the hierarchy, control, or social calibration that once flowed through them. Influence, once tangible in the placement of guests, the flow of conversation, and the timing of events, has become an object of observation rather than participation. The mansion demonstrates that permanence of structure does not guarantee permanence of effect. Its archives, too, contribute to this reflection. Ledgers, correspondence, and notes preserve the logic of operation and the rhythm of authority. Yet they are no longer instruments, they are evidence. They reveal the meticulous discipline that maintained hierarchy, the calibration of relationships, and the precise projection of social and economic influence. To examine these documents is to witness power suspended, a record of what once shaped outcomes, of what once rendered social and economic networks legible, now fixed in stillness and removed from enactment. The mansion's influence is echoed in its cultural resonance. Architects, historians, and cultural commentators continue to reference its design, systems, and ritual. The estate operates as a lens through which the mechanisms of elite power can be understood, yet always retrospectively. It frames questions about the exercise of authority, the codification of hierarchy, and the fragility of networks reliant on constant attention. Through these reflections, the mansion communicates less about immediate action and more about the principles and practices that underpinned influence in its time. Even the surrounding grounds contribute to the narrative of legacy. Terraces, gardens, and axial alignments preserve the intentional ordering of space, recalling the interplay between human design and social projection. The landscape retains cues of circulation, observation, and display, yet these are cues divorced from the activity that once sustained them. Nature slowly reasserts itself, softening edges, filling voids, and revealing the distinction between preserved form and operative function. The mansion, in its present state, illustrates the difference between enduring material presence and the dynamic enactment of institutional culture.